First of all, good afternoon. And I would like to thank Sandra and Kuhn for the invitation to be here, as well as for your support for my work for so many years now. Thank you as well to everyone who has organized Noise and to all of you for being here today. I'm going to be speaking about some new work on imagery of the border. So I look forward to learning your thoughts and learning from you. Sandra began by invoking that phrase, "We didn't cross the border crossed us," which is an oft heard slogan among Mexican and Chicanx immigration rights activists. We see it reflected here in this image of unknown provenance that has become a meme and presumably taken at an immigration rights protest in the US. This phrase evokes the complex history of land ownership and dispossession in the United States and a border that has shifted over time. So as you can see in these maps here, over the course of the 19th century, a series of treaties and annexations have radically shifted the border, increasingly amassing a land base for the United States up until 1848, when the border came to resemble the one that exists today. What these maps don't show, of course, is that these lands were not terra nullius, the term that was used by settler colonizers to deem their so-called discovered lands uninhabited, and thus giving them the legal right to steal it through the doctrine of discovery, but rather these were the homes of indigenous people, of mestizas, the term that connotes people of mixed indigenous and European ancestry, and Spanish settlers. So the phrase, "We didn't cross the border crossed us," articulates how the border as a territorial marker, or what media and migration scholar Lily Huliraki calls the enacted border, exists in tension with the social location and identities of the people who have built their lives on the land. I am proposing that for US citizens, the southern border is not an ontological category that is implicitly known or eternal, but rather an epistemological phenomenon that specifically is an epistemology of the colonizer, and it's shaped and overdetermined contemporary ways of knowing about land and about the people who live on and cross the border. In this lecture, I'll be exploring a new project that I've been taking to explore the epistemologies of the US-Mexico border, specifically its affective dimensions. I will be describing and inviting you to engage in the methods that I have been using to understand what I am calling a border of affect. The southern border, as constituted by affective responses to artistic representations that shed light on oppressive immigration policies. Borders of affect, I propose, are a dimension of affective cartography that is produced by and in turn reproduces a cultural imaginary that situates the citizen's relationship to migration. What my work is aiming to show is that, in fact, the affects generated by representations of the border are quite often negative affects shared across political beliefs, but that the affects function as a kind of Rorschach test that refract deeply held feelings about the US as a site of migration. So I'm going to first speak to the foundational assumptions of my study, situate myself as a researcher, discuss the qualitative research methods that I used to identify affective responses and their relationship to political views, and articulate my observations on the borders of affect in relationship to key scholarship on radical cartography, media, and migration. First of all, I want to be clear that I am not speaking of the border as a territorial marker that is so often taken for a given. You may, like me, have had the experience where you had to tell students that, in fact, everything they know about borders is wrong. The border is constructed The map of nation states as we know it is a recent phenomenon, that borders regularly change. And one example that I find sort of particularly interesting to use with students is a 2016 land swap and renegotiated border between Belgium and the Netherlands in response to a legal problem about legal jurisdiction over a severed head. So apparently a couple stumbled over a headless body, called the Dutch authorities, said, please do something about this headless body. They were informed that the strip of land was in fact under Belgian jurisdiction. The Belgian authorities could not get there by land without crossing Dutch territory, which required special permission. And the only alternative was a difficult river crossing. So the two nations decided to head off future jurisdictional problems by negotiating a peaceful transfer of the parcels of land that each country had that were stranded on the wrong side of the border. And you can see here the 2016 border marked present border and then the renegotiated border on this map. But rather than speaking of the border as a territorial marker, I am framing it as a way of knowing the world, or a series of ways of knowing the world. Put differently, who we are, our cultures, our social locations, our identities, our own relationships to migration shape how we know the world and its borders. These facets of identity produce our affective relationships to borders, mediated through attendant phenomena like immigration laws, nationalism, and xenophobia. In Ugly Feelings, some of which I asked you to read for today, Sayan Nagai suggests that literature, and we could perhaps expand this more broadly to other cultural forms like art, may be an ideal space to investigate ugly feelings. And she is concerned with how feelings like envy, anxiety, paranoia, and irritation mediate the aesthetic and the political. So what I am exploring is how artistic representations of the oppressions enacted at the border tell us about how borders produce affect, and thus render the border an epistemological phenomenon focalized through these affects. And I situate this work as part of feminist cartographies, which argue that emotion and affect are legitimate ways of knowing. A crucial dimension of feminist scholarship is recognizing, our standpoints, our own identities. It situate and influence the work we do. So I want to share my own relationship to borders, and I invite you to think about your work, your work in relationship to your own as well. My family is from Kashmir, a region in India and Pakistan that has been a disputed territory for the last 75 years. On this slide, you can see a wonderful example of digital bordering. If you are in India looking at a Google map, you will see what appears to be an undisputed solid line border of the nation state that encompasses Kashmir within India's domain. If you are in Pakistan or indeed anywhere else in the world, looking at a Google map, you will see a contested border, a dotted line. Both of my parents were originally from parts of Kashmir that are now in Pakistan, but because they practiced the Sikh religion, they became part of the massive forced migration during the partition of India in 1947. Many Muslims were forced to leave India for Pakistan. Many Hindus and Sikhs were forced to leave Pakistan for India. As children, my parents were refugees. As adults, they decided they could not raise a family in Kashmir because they had lived through too many wars, seen too many family and friends die. They didn't see an end in sight, and to this day, there has not been an end. So they left for the United Kingdom, where my sister and I were born. And in the mid-'80s, they became economic migrants and moved to the US. And so I very much see my experience, my scholarship mediated through first the contested border between India and Pakistan, and then the borders in the US and the UK, where as an immigrant, I benefited from good timing and privilege. So when I was born, I was eligible for citizenship in the UK simply by being born there, which would change in 1983, in which your parents' status then makes a difference. And my parents were able to go to the UK in the first place because at that time, Commonwealth citizens had a right to abode, which would also later change. because I had an uncle who had already immigrated to the US, we were able to easily get visas to come here. Also, we were coming from the UK. So that was a factor as well. So this is very much shapes my research and my thinking. Another key part of how I see feminist scholarship working effectively is storytelling. So I do want to tell you about the moment that this idea of the borders of affect sort of was something that I recognize may exist. So about 7 years ago, I was on a committee that selected our first year reading experience books. This is a thing very popular in the US where all first year students coming into a college read the same book and then on the first day of school participate in discussion groups about the book. So I was on the committee that selected this book, Spare Parts, which tells the story of a team of undocumented high school students who participated in a college level underwater robotics competition and beat teams including MIT at it. These, elite college teams had access to state-of-the-art polymers and corporate sponsorships, and these students had their natural talents and gifts in engineering and the experiences they learned from watching family members working as gardeners and mechanics. At the time, my student population was predominantly white and working class, though this has actually changed. Some had protested at reading about undocumented people. And in the discussion groups, they rehearsed the tropes that are very familiar in the US. We're a nation of immigrants, which, by the way, we are not. There are indigenous people here and are presently colonized by the US. Of course, we want the good immigrants. We don't want the bad immigrants. If you want to come to the US, do it the right way, come through the official channels. Essentially, the kinds of xenophobia that is acceptable to many in the US. The students were essentially parroting the rhetoric of what Lily Huliaraki has called the narrated border, born from media portrayals that position some migrant populations as undesirable and some as desirable. And then one of the students who was featured in Spare Parts, who had been our convocation speaker, came to my discussion group. And the students, their affective responses to being in the presence of a known undocumented person were palpable in the looks on their faces and in their body language. And it was the border of affect. It was this cultural imaginary of the border and the affects it conjures entering the room. I could feel it, and Lorenzo Santillan, the student from the book, could feel it. So I took a narrative approach to the discussion we were supposed to be having. I asked my students to consider me and Lorenzo, two immigrants there in the room. Like Lorenzo, I was brought to the US as a child with no say in the matter. We spoke the same English. We used the same slang. We had generally the same skin color, but I am documented and he is not. So we shared our experiences, Lorenzo and I, of coming to the US as children and asked the students to consider why we arrived under such different circumstances. And I remember the looks on their faces as their sort of paranoia, anxiety, and disgust shifted to something else. In some cases, it was confusion. And in some cases, it seemed like it might be empathy. As on the very first day of college, they struggled to rationalize how two people who seemed to have so much in common could have had their entire world so immeasurably shaped by which border we crossed. So this experience generated my interest in better understanding how acts of representation elicit or perhaps can even reshape borders of affect. So to study this question, I selected 4 artistic responses to the groundswell of public attention to immigration at the US-Mexico border in 2018. That year, the Trump administration issued the family separation policy, in which Customs and Border Patrol and Immigration Enforcement tore apart children from their parents, detaining them separately from each other. As of 2021, as of this year, many of these families have yet to be reunited. On social media and in the mainstream media, the introduction of the family separation policies captured a news cycle as reporters and social media users circulated images like the one you see here of a parent being searched by an immigration enforcement officer as a child cries, videos of children ripped away from their parents, pictures of warehouses used to hold immigrants, and the images of children in cages. And as they did, they expressed shock, dismay, disgust, articulating a border of affect. And then as soon as the news cycle moved on, so did they. In the absence of affect, something provoking affective response, the border virtually disappeared from public consciousness, but likely not without shaping their ways of knowing the border. Curious about how artistic responses to these events might now produce affects and what they might tell us about borders of affect when viewed outside of the scope of the news cycle, sort of thinking back to that moment in the classroom with my students and seeing their responses to the conversations in this reading group. I had a hunch that US citizens' affective ways of knowing the border had not disappeared from their consciousness entirely. So I designed a study based in grounded theory research, systematically collecting my data, coding it, and seeing what theoretical insights might emerge from it. I undertook a qualitative survey in which I asked participants to view 4 artistic responses to the family separation policy and to describe their reactions through an open-ended comment, as well as to rate the intensity of their responses on a Likert scale from 1 to 5. The anonymous survey also requested information about their political self-identifications based on political parties and political spectrums, so whether they saw themselves as being sort of more conservative, moderate, liberal, or more liberal. And I also asked about their views on immigration policy, because I wanted to see sort of if there's some kind of thread we can find between aesthetics, affect, and politics. I used a snowball sampling method. So I began with an acquaintance who is a US citizen by birth, because I restricted this to US citizens. One identified with each party and each location on the political spectrum, and then requested their referrals of additional participants until I had reached the saturation point in my data where additional sampling was not substantially changing the results, but instead was giving me redundancy in the data. Given that I was looking for responses across political beliefs, both to compare them and to look for trends within political self-identifications, my sample size ended up being larger than I really ever used before for a qualitative study. It was 97. I subsequently coded the data according to categories of affect as well as lack of affective response, but generally there were affective responses. Now, what I'd hoped to do before discussing the results of my study and the theoretical insights derived from them was actually to give you the opportunity to view and share your responses to the 4 artistic representations that the participants viewed. However, both we have a time problem and we have a sound problem. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to share the links to everything with you in the chat. And I'm going to sort of tell you about the sources that people looked at. So the first is Torn Apart Separados, a project that I worked on myself. Now you have the links, so you can look at it. This is a series of data visualizations that a group of colleagues and I undertook in 1 week in June 2018 at the height of the media cycle on the family separation policy. I hadn't thought about Torn Apart Separados as art. We were actually thinking of it more as data storytelling until it was included in museum exhibitions such as the artist activist collective Sin Huela's exhibition Detention Nation, and then it was selected for inclusion in New York City's Museo del Barrio's triennial, their first large-scale survey of Latinx contemporary art. So I asked participants to look at what you're seeing here, what has become the iconic image of Torn Apart Separados, our map of immigrant detention centers. And what you're seeing is large orange dots that represent detention centers that as of 2018 were in use and had populations. Smaller orange dots that show institutions like county jails that were contracted to Immigrations and Customs Enforcement for use to detain immigrants, but at that time didn't have any in them. And then the little harder to see purple dots, which were the shelters where children were being held. The next representation I asked people to look at was a clip of a video by artist, activist collective Sin Huelas. And I'm going to put the link to it in the chat. So this is a video of their exhibition, and what they do is they essentially recreate the inside of an immigrant detention center holding area. So they have sort of bunk beds, they have images of bodies wrapped in this mylar kind of silver foil. They have barbed wire, they have letters on the walls that are in the words of migrants, so their thoughts on their experiences in immigrant detention. And the idea behind this was to try and stimulate an affective response and a reaction from viewers who often don't see the inside of immigrant detention centers. They don't really have a sense of what goes on inside. The next one that I had people look at was a pop-up art installation called Don't Look Away, put together by Raíces, which is a nonprofit organization that provides low-cost legal aid for migrants, and also they do a lot of advocacy work. And what they had done was, in cities across the US, they put the pop-up exhibit that you will see in this video, which is a cage, a sort of mannequin intended to represent a child in a cage. And actually there's also a sonic component as well, where you hear sort of audible distress and cries of children. And then the final one was the performance by Jennifer Lopez and Shakira at the Super Bowl halftime show in 2020. Super Bowl is a football competition in the US. It's one of the most widely watched events in the US. And in it, they feature children, representations of children in cages. First, they're all singing "Let's Get Loud," and then Jennifer Lopez says, "Let's get loud, Latinos." And then they transition into singing "Born in the USA." So it's this really interesting juxtaposition of this sort of the representation of children in cages, and a request for advocacy and protest, all in an event that is people believe often is apolitical. So to summarize, I wish I had been able to do the interactive part, but my sound is not playing well. So let me switch back to my slides and to tell you a little bit about my findings. So in terms, all participants, regardless of political affiliation, reported the most intense responses on that Likert scale to the artistic responses in the following order. So Super Bowl generated the most intense response. Then Don't Look Away, the pop-up exhibit of the children in cages. Then Detention Nation, and then Torn Apart Separados. This can perhaps be attributed to several factors. First, the Super Bowl has had such an important cultural role in the US. And immigration notwithstanding, it tends to generate intense responses, both positive and negative, depending on whether one sees it as a positive or a negative event. Moreover, the question of whether sports should be political or not is one that has been subject to much debate in the US in recent years, particularly in football, about whether or not players should be allowed to take a knee to protest racism when the US anthem is played at the beginning of sports events. In 2017, in response to the election of Trump, there was an outcry when a number of advertisements during the Super Bowl. Now, the Super Bowl is the most expensive ad spots on US television. A number of advertisements for really innocuous items like lumber and avocados made explicit statements in their ads in favor of immigration or against building a wall at the US-Mexico border in reaction to the election of Donald Trump. So this became a really hot button political issue. Next, Don't Look Away as a pop-up exhibit seems to really evoke multiple senses, appeals to multiple modes of communication. So it's both the interplay of the visual of the cage, the body, and then the sound of children in this clear distress that seems to account for it having produced an intense response. Detention Nation largely relies on the visual shock value and the words of immigrants, perhaps because it's more sort of visual, single mode of communication, might be why it provokes a less intense response. And then finally, Torn Apart Separados is solely reliant on a visual regime. Also a more abstract geographical concept that also requires some geographical literacy and understanding of mapping to parse. What's really curious is that across all of these representations, the affects that participants reported were largely the same. Disgust, anger, fear, and sadness. When we look at how these responses then break down by political affiliation, we see that even though the affects were the same, the context in which these affects were being articulated were actually quite different. So in the case of the Super Bowl halftime show, discussed by participants who also expressed concern over the perceived looseness of immigration policy, so typically these were the Republican or conservative identified participants, appear to have been disgusted by what they perceived as propaganda delivered by Jennifer Lopez and Shakira. On the other hand, disgust by those who expressed concern over the perceived oppressiveness of immigration policies, and this typically accorded with the self-identified Democrats and liberals, was directed at the family separation policy and at the idea of children in cages. So the affects themselves were similar, but the context of them was different. In the case of Don't Look Away, looking at the context of sadness, an affect that appeared across the sample, we see the sort of fraught role of empathy in the mobilization of border imagery. Those who favored harsher immigration policies expressed sadness that the US had to find a way to manage migrant child populations because the migrants just wouldn't stop coming here. While those who held neutral or critical views of repressive immigration policies expressed sadness that the US treats migrants in these ways. So for those on the right side of the political spectrum, their empathetic investment was lying in the nation state and in the consolidation of a border, while for other participants, their empathy was primarily directed at human beings. What my findings suggest is that the affects themselves were similar, the intensity of the affects were similar, and may be attributable to the modes of communication that the artistic responses engaged. But whether these negative affects were mobilized towards favoring more repressive or looser immigration policies really broke down across polarized political lines, which isn't surprising, with those who identified as more right-leaning expressing negative affects that were responding to migrants themselves, and those identifying as more left-leaning expressing negative affective responses to oppressive governmental policy. The negative affects we can perhaps then understand as a border of affect, an epistemological border constructed through shared negative affective responses The ways of knowing this border of affect is mediated through one's political identity. The border of affect is further one that focalizes participants' empathetic responses through the investment in the sanctity of the nation state or their investment in human lives. May I ask Kuhn and Sandra, even though I know that we're getting on to the time of the schedule, I've only been speaking for 30 minutes, so may I have a little bit more time? Is that all right? Yes, okay, perfect, great. Okay, because I want to talk about how this sort of fits into scholarship on affective cartographies, media, and migration. As a theoretical concept, the borders of affect are situated at the nexus of these discourses and offers a way of understanding how the border exists in cognitive forms, independent of a base map. That is a way of knowing and constructing a mental model of migration. Movements in radical cartography highlight the personal and affective dimensions of space. So scholars like Sebastian Kakar, William Cartwright, and others have envisioned a relationship between maps and narratives, grounded in the belief that while maps are often read as neutral depictions of space, they are in fact representations and arguments that can be used to identify a relationship between story and place. And what's always really crucial to remember that Kakar has observed is that cartographers historically have used the narratives of travelers and explorers to fill in the blank spots on their maps. So even the base maps that we know, like Google Maps, OpenStreetMaps, these have narrative origins. Now the mapping of stories typically takes the form of layered annotations, symbols, or data that's put onto these maps. This narrative dimension of cartography opens up space to understand how borders of affect are composed through the stories we tell ourselves about migration. Kakar, Cartwright, and others like Barbara Piatti have taken the lead on developing contemporary notions of affective cartography, which leverages the relationships between people, the locations they know, and the relationship of positive and negative affects conjured in people by space. Fundamental to how I am conceptualizing the cartographic dimensions of the borders of affect is Anchi Len's acknowledgement that all maps only function under the premise of omitting or distorting parts of reality. Therefore, the borders of affect may be understood as produced through the factors that shape an individual's realities, their social locations, their identities, and their own perspectives on migration. Approaches to affective cartography include the collaborative creation of maps that foreground the subjective dimension of space, and these can take many forms, from mapping of cultural phenomenon, as in cultural atlases, to collaborative mapping projects. One example you can see here is Stanford Literary Lab's map, The Emotions of London, in which they created a data set of sentiments about places in London in the 18th and 19th century and in British novels. They mapped the feelings associated with various parts of the city. So what you can see here is a map of class and affect, with red indicating fear, green indicating happiness, gold indicating upper and middle class locations, blue low-income areas, and black the lowest class. At the personal level for individuals, families, and communities, the availability of out-of-the-box tools like Google My Maps allows users and groups of people to drop pins and document their personal relationships to space. I just put on an example of a map my partner made for me when I said I wanted a new job, and he said, here are all the places that I am willing to live. But not all mapping needs to be technological, as evidenced by Barcelona-based artist Liz Konecki's Bangalore Urban Fabric, a public intervention in which people marked places that are significant to them on a hand-embroidered map of Bangalore. So with needle and thread, they created symbols that responded to questions like, where is the heart of the city? What is a place that is positive for the community? Where is a place that is unsafe, etc. In their articulation of an artistic perspective for affective cartography, Teresa Iturrios and Monica Wachowicz propose that cartography is mediated through an exchange across contemporary art, new media art, design projects, and sociocultural levels of aggregation. They therefore argue that affective cartography need not be bounded or constrained by conventional notions of cartography, so by the base maps themselves, And there are really great examples of this in indigenous cartography, which seeks to decolonize, distort, or entirely dispense with the maps that are based on Cartesian coordinates that represent the history of colonialism. A really well-known example is native lands, which layers shapes onto a base map to indicate how contemporary locations correspond with traditional lands of indigenous people. This is where I am on the historical land of Pawtucket Nation, stewarded today by the Massachusetts Tribal Nation. Another approach is actually remapping using through indigenous perspectives. So this is a map of the Great Lake region in the US with Ojibwe place names as articulated by the Ojibwe Nation. And for an example of narrative cartography that dispenses with the colonial base map entirely, Siksika artist Adrian Stimson created this map of First Nation stories in Canada from the Calgary Stampede, which is a First Nation celebration of culture. And the map includes Blackfoot ways of knowing by using pictographs in linear spiral or snake-like patterns painted on a bison robe. Narrative, affective, and decolonial maps demonstrate that space is reshaped according to subjective and non-visible ideas. Borders of affect are thus one more level of abstraction from these types of maps, an epistemological phenomenon that conjures a border through the affects it generates and positions citizens on either side in relation to their own beliefs about migration. By extension, the work of affective cartography is to leverage non-representational spatial experiences. And in this vein, the borders of affect are an affective cartography, a non-representational instantiation of the border derived from the affective responses it generates in relation to the complex cultural mediations of space. Mons Bissenbacher and Lina Myung have made the case for affective turns in migration studies. They note that the management of migration takes place through the invocation and governing of political and public and personal affect, conjuring imagery of threat and danger to naturalize an aggressive attitude towards migrants. Affective bordering, as they describe it, constitutes the ways that migration policy, surveillance, and management function as a form of biopolitical instrumentalization. Borders of affect, as I describe them, overlap with but are distinct from practices of affective bordering, as I'm examining not the practices that constitute migration policy directly, but the constitution of an epistemological border in the cultural milieu. Borders of affect and public responses to migration, of course, are inextricable from practices of bordering, symbolic or otherwise, as they influence elections and politicians. But in and of themselves, they constitute a border imaginary that is essentially an affective layer that supersedes the territorial fact of the border in the mind and its attendant practices of migrant management. In fact, given that in the US, so many people struggle with geographic illiteracy that 20% of Americans cannot find the US on a map, a sizable population nonetheless maintains rigorous certainty that migration from south of the border is unwanted. So this physical border has really been subordinated to an epistemological border that exists in the mind. Borders of affect derive in part from what Lily Huiraki calls the narrated border, the media portrayals that construe these arriving populations as desirable versus undesirable, which I mentioned earlier. Along with Pierluigi Massaro, she theorizes the border as a mediatized border, a site where digital media narrate and perform connections for and barriers against human mobility. While their study focuses on migrants, NGOs, and other aid workers at the border, I'm suggesting that borders of affect constitutes a different kind of symbolic border, a cognitive phenomenon, an invisible border that exists among citizens in sites of immigration. They're undeniably influenced by but separate from the mediatized border, just as it is influenced by but separate from a territorial marker of a border. An interesting extension of my study, though I have not yet had a chance to pursue this is all very new, would be to actually expand it to see how naturalized US citizens, permanent residents, and undocumented people identify how the border of affect manifests through different and differing legal relationships to the nation state. This would perhaps shed light on how we might rethink the ways we mobilize border imagery to promote empathy, because it's crucial that we find ways to reframe narratives of migration, like the work of this artist who put up seesaws through the slats of the border wall, to imagine new forms of connection between citizen and migrant on either side of the border, and to make it impossible for citizens to look away. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.